For God's sake, does someone want to tell the scholarship girl to stop pretending she understands? Professor Edmund Hayes slammed his hand on the desk. The sharp crack echoed through the lecture hall. 200 students fell silent at once. Professor Edmund Hayes stood at the front of Whitmore University's largest mathematics auditorium. A hall built like a small amphitheater rose rising steeply toward the ceiling. The afternoon sun filtered through tall windows, casting long lines of light across polished wooden desks. His jaw was tight, his gray hair perfectly combed, his dark suit immaculate, and his eyes were locked on one person, Thea Gibson, 19 years old, scholarship student, Atlanta, Georgia. She sat in the fifth row, notebook open, pen still in her hand. The room felt smaller than it was. "I will not," Hayes continued, his voice cutting through the air, "have enthusiasm mistaken for understanding in my seminar." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the upper rows. Thea did not laugh. She kept her back straight. On the board behind him was written a dense structure of symbols: Dirichlet L functions, complex variables, critical lines, zeros. This was not undergraduate material. This was advanced analytic number theory, a subject Hayes was legendary for. 58 years old, 217 published papers, 40 years in academia, a 60% drop rate in this very course. Students did not challenge Edmund Hayes. They survived him, or they left. He turned back toward the board. "Since Miss Gibson seems eager to contribute," he said coldly, "perhaps she would like to demonstrate her understanding." Thea's stomach tightened. She had raised her hand 20 minutes earlier, not to challenge him, but to ask a clarification about an assumption he had made regarding the distribution of non-trivial zeros. A small question, a precise one. But in Hayes's classroom, precision from a first-year student was perceived as arrogance. "Come," he said. Not loudly, but it carried authority. Phones were already subtly lifted. A few students sensed something memorable was about to happen. Thea slowly stood. Every step toward the front felt exposed, amplified. She could feel eyes on her, curious, skeptical, waiting. Hayes stepped aside with theatrical courtesy. On the board, he wrote quickly, "Prove that the first 100 non-trivial zeros of the Dirichlet L function associated with character chi lie on the critical line Res equals 1/2. A murmur spread through the hall. That was not a classroom exercise. That was research-level verification. "And," Hayes added, glancing at his watch, "you have 10 minutes. The room froze. Even graduate students in the back straightened. 10 minutes? It was impossible. Hayes folded his arms. "If you succeed," he said calmly, "I will personally recommend you for any research program you wish." A pause. "And if you fail, perhaps you will reconsider whether this field is beyond your depth." There it was, publicly, a scholarship student, on the edge. Thea felt heat rise in her face, not from fear, from something else. She had worked too many night shifts tutoring high school students, had studied too many evenings under flickering lights, had ignored too many subtle comments about admissions quotas and diversity placements. She knew what this was, not just a math problem, a test of belonging. She picked up the chalk. It felt heavier than it should have. The clock above the exit door ticked. 200 students watched. Professor Hayes smiled faintly. He had designed this, carefully, because some lessons, he believed, must be learned publicly, and at that moment, he was absolutely certain she was about to learn hers. The second hand on the wall clock moved. One sharp tick. Thea stared at the equation, not at the surface complexity, but at its structure. Professor Hayes leaned back against the desk, arms folded, the posture of a man who had already predicted the ending of this story. "Time is running," he said softly. A few students shifted in their seats. Someone in the back began quietly recording. The glow of phone screens flickered like distant fireflies. Thea exhaled slowly. 10 minutes. He believed the constraint was the trap. But the trap wasn't the time. It was expectation. She rewrote the main expression carefully, isolating the Dirichlet character chi. The chalk made a steady, deliberate sound against the board. No shaking, no hesitation. Hayes noticed. Interesting. Most students, when cornered, rushed. They scribbled. They tried to impress. They drowned in notation. She didn't. Instead of attacking the zeros directly, she rewrote the L function in a transformed representation, connecting it to a modular structure. A murmur rippled across the first few rows. Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly. That was not the standard approach. 3 minutes. She introduced a symmetry argument, subtle, elegant, reducing the verification for the first 100 zeros into a computationally bounded framework. A graduate student in the back stopped leaning back in his chair. 5 minutes. Hayes uncrossed his arms. "This is performative," he said calmly, though more to himself than to her. "She's rearranging notation." But she wasn't. She was building a bridge. Instead of checking each zero individually, she constructed a mapping, showing that under a specific transformation, deviations from the critical line would violate a bounded functional identity. 7 minutes. The room was completely silent now. No laughter, no whispers, only chalk. Thea paused briefly, not because she was lost, but because she was calculating, internally, rapidly. She could feel Hayes's gaze on her back. She knew what he was waiting for. The mistake, the overreach, the collapse. Instead, she boxed an intermediate result. Cases would contradict the symmetry cases would contradict the symmetry condition implied here. Her voice was steady, not loud, but clear. Hayes stepped closer. 8 minutes. He scanned the board. His expression changed, almost imperceptibly. She wasn't hand-waving. She had constructed a conditional proof structure. 9 minutes. Thea wrote the final transformation, reduced, balanced. Then she wrote, "Thus, verified for the first 100 non-trivial zeros." She set the chalk down. 9 minutes and 23 seconds. The room felt suspended in air. Hayes moved closer to the board, closer. He examined the mapping, the reduction, the functional identity. His jaw tightened. It was unconventional, but it was rigorous. And more importantly, it was correct. No one breathed. 200 students waiting for the verdict. Hayes turned slowly toward her. For the first time since she had entered his seminar, he did not look certain. And for the first time in decades, Professor Edmund Hayes felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not anger, not authority, not control. Something else. Uncertainty. The silence stretched, long enough to become uncomfortable. And then, from the second row, a single stunned whisper, "She did it." The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, first with a whisper, then with the faint scrape of someone shifting forward in their seat. Professor Edmund Hayes did not look at the students. He looked at the board, line by line, slowly, carefully. Thea stood to the side, hands traced the first transformation with his, traced the first transformation with his finger. Correct. He moved to the symmetry reduction. Unusual, but logically sound. His eyes narrowed at the conditional mapping she had introduced in Minute 6. That was the boldest step. 200 students watched the most. 200 students watched the most feared professor at Whitmore University reread a freshman's work in complete silence. A bead of tension passed through the room. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Finally, Hayes stepped back. He turned to her. "Explain," he said. Not loudly, but not dismissively either. Thea nodded once. She walked back toward the board. When you assume a deviation from the critical line within the first 100 zeros, she began calmly, you create a contradiction within the functional symmetry under this transformation. She pointed to the mapping she had constructed. It restricts the possible deviation without requiring direct verification of each case. A graduate student in the back muttered, "That's clever." Hayes heard it. He did not react. Thea continued, "I'm not claiming a general proof for all zeros, only bounded verification under the defined symmetry constraint. Clear, precise, no overstatement." Hayes studied her. Not the math. Her. There was no arrogance in her tone, no performance, only structure, only logic. He turned back to the board one last time, and then he said the words no one expected to hear. "The argument is valid." The air shifted. Not applause. Not yet. Just shock. Hayes inhaled slowly. "For the bounded case," he added carefully, "this holds." It was as much acknowledgement as he was capable of offering in public. "May sit down." No praise, no warmth, but may sit down. No praise, no warmth, but no dismissal either. Thea nodded once. She returned to her seat. Her heart was racing now, but her face remained composed. Phones lowered. Whispers erupted in controlled bursts. "Did you see that? How did she? That's grad level." Hayes erased the board slowly, deliberately, as if reclaiming territory. "Let this be a reminder," he said evenly, "that mathematics rewards structure, not spectacle." But his voice had lost something, its sharp edge. The class resumed. He continued the lecture. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Students were no longer simply absorbing. They were watching him, measuring him. For the first time in years, the power dynamic in the room had shifted, even if only slightly. And Hayes felt it. At the end of the seminar, as students packed their bags in restless murmurs, Thea remained seated for a moment. She knew this was not over. Public humiliation had been attempted. Public correction had occurred. But men like Edmund Hayes did not forget moments like this. They restructured them. Outside the hall, word was already spreading. Clips were being shared, messages sent. "Scholarship girl destroys Hayes challenge." By evening, the video would circulate through academic group chats. By morning, faculty would have seen it. And somewhere, in a quiet office lined with framed publications and decades of achievement, Professor Edmund Hayes would replay the moment again. Not the proof, not the applause, but the instant when he realized he had underestimated her. And he would begin calculating, not equations, but consequences. Because humiliation, when it fails, often transforms into something far more dangerous. The following morning, Whitmore University did not feel the same. Students glanced at Thea in the hallways. Some nodded, some stared, some whispered. The clip had spread overnight, not viral in the public sense, but viral enough within academic circles, graduate group chats, department emails, even a few alumni networks. "Did you see Hayes get challenged?" "No," corrected. By 9 a.m., Professor Edmund Hayes had already received 3 messages from colleagues. Polite, neutral, curious, he ignored them. At 10:30 a.m., there was a knock on his office door. He didn't look up immediately. "Come in." Thea stepped inside. His office was exactly what one would expect from a man of his reputation. Tall bookshelves filled with number theory volumes, framed journal covers, awards in polished glass cases. On the wall behind his desk hung a framed copy of his most cited paper from 1993, the foundation of his reputation. He closed the journal he had been pretending to read. "Yes, Miss Gibson." Her posture was straight. "I wanted to speak with you about the summer research recommendation." His expression did not change. "The one you mentioned yesterday," she continued calmly. "You said if I succeeded, you would consider recommending me." Hayes folded his hands. "What occurred yesterday," he said slowly, was a bounded demonstration. It does not establish research-level maturity. There it was, the pivot, the reframing. She nodded slightly. I understand that. He leaned back in his chair. Enthusiasm is not the same as depth, he continued. Mathematics requires endurance, perspective, a certain refinement. The implication hung between them. She met his gaze. With respect, Professor, my approach was rigorous. Yes, he said evenly, for a classroom setting. A pause. He stood and walked toward the window, looking down at the campus lawn below. You must understand, he said without turning around, that summer research programs are competitive. They do not reward clever tricks. Clever tricks. That was how he was rewriting it. She remained calm. I'm not asking for favoritism, she said. Only a fair evaluation. He turned back toward her. And you will receive one. He returned to his desk and sat down. I will observe your performance over the remainder of the term. A delay. A condition. Not a commitment. She understood. This was no longer about a recommendation letter. It was about control. I see, she said quietly. He studied her. You are talented, he admitted carefully, but talent without discipline often collapses. She nodded. Thank you for your time. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. Miss Gibson. She turned. Be cautious about mistaking a moment for a pattern. The message was clear. One victory does not redefine hierarchy. She left the office. The door closed softly behind her. Inside, Hayes sat very still. He opened his laptop. The video clip was already in his inbox, sent by a colleague with a simple line. Impressive student. He watched it. Not once, twice, 3 times. He did not focus on her explanation. He focused on the class, on their faces, on the shift, respect, and something else. Comparison. That evening, Hayes drafted a new quiz for his seminar. Unscheduled, unannounced, 5 problems, graduate level, no symmetry shortcuts, no bounded reductions, pure technical depth. He stared at the document. He told himself this was fairness, rigor, standards, not retaliation, but somewhere beneath the justification, there was something colder. He saved the file. Tomorrow, he would restore balance. And in another part of campus, sitting alone in the library, Thea opened her notebook. She had sensed it. The recalibration. Men who built empires on reputation did not surrender authority quietly. She began reviewing deeper material, not because she feared the quiz, but because she understood something important now. The real test had only just begun. The announcement came without warning. Professor Hayes entered the lecture hall the next afternoon, carrying a thin stack of papers instead of his usual notebook. His expression was neutral. Too neutral. Before we begin, he said, placing the stack on the desk, a short assessment. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. There are 5 problems, he continued. You have 40 minutes. A student raised his hand. Professor, is this graded? Hayes adjusted his cuff. Everything in this seminar is graded. The papers began moving down the rows. Thea felt the weight of the sheet before she even read it. The first problem referenced advanced analytic continuation techniques not covered in lecture. The second required deep familiarity with zero-density estimates. The third moved into elliptic curve L functions, territory usually reserved for graduate coursework. This was not reinforcement. This was escalation. Around her, students exchanged uneasy glances. Someone whispered, "Is this even in the syllabus?" Hayes did not respond. The clock began ticking. Thea read every problem carefully, not rushed, not panicked. She recognized what he was doing. If she failed publicly, yesterday's victory would dissolve into narrative, a fluke. If she struggled, he could redefine the hierarchy. She began with problem 3, the elliptic curve connection. He had noticed that part of her proof. Of course he had. He wanted to see if it was intuition or understanding. She structured her argument methodically. No shortcuts, no leaps. Every justification written cleanly. Around her, pages were turning rapidly. Some students were frozen, staring blankly. 10 minutes passed, 15, 20. The room felt heavier than it had the day before. This wasn't spectacle, this was pressure. Thea finished problem 3, moved to problem 1. She could sense Hayes walking slowly between rows, observing, measuring. He paused briefly beside her desk. His shadow fell across her paper. He did not speak, but he saw something that unsettled him. Structure, clarity, not panic. 30 minutes. A student in the back quietly put his pen down, defeated. Another stared at the ceiling. Thea continued. 35 minutes. She completed 4 problems fully. The 5th, the most abstract, she outlined with conditional reasoning, marking assumptions carefully. 40 minutes. Time. Papers were collected. The silence afterward felt sharp. Hayes stacked the quizzes without expression. No discussion, he said. Results next week. As students filed out, tension lingered. Outside the hall, whispers resumed. That was impossible. Was that even fair? He's proving something. Thea walked alone toward the library. Not triumphant, not afraid, just aware. She knew the grading would not be simple arithmetic. It would be interpretation. And interpretation, in the hands of someone protecting status, could become something else entirely. That evening in his office, Hayes began marking. He moved quickly at first. Most papers confirmed his expectation. Incomplete, shallow, strained. Then he reached hers. He read slowly. Problem 3. Correct. Thorough. Even elegant. Problem 1. Solid. Precise. Problem 2. Advanced, but logically consistent. His jaw tightened. He moved to problem 5. She had not fully resolved it, but her conditional framework was defensible. It demonstrated understanding beyond the undergraduate level. He leaned back in his chair. The room was silent except for the hum of the desk lamp. He looked again at the name at the top of the page. Thea Gibson. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he picked up his pen and began writing comments in the margin. Unconventional approach. Insufficient formal rigor. Lacks traditional structure. He deducted points. Not enough to appear malicious. Just enough. When he finished, the grade at the top read C-. He stared at it. He told himself it was objectivity, that brilliance required refinement, that discipline mattered more than creativity. He placed her paper in the graded stack, but as he turned off the lamp, one thought lingered. Not whether she had succeeded, but whether he had. The quizzes were returned 3 days later. No speech, no commentary. Professor Hayes simply placed the stack at the edge of his desk. You may collect them, he said. The room felt tense before anyone even moved. Thea waited until most had returned to. Their seats. Then she walked forward. Her name was near the bottom of the stack. She recognized her handwriting before she saw the grade. C-. For a brief second, the numbers didn't register. Then they did. She looked again. C-. Her eyes scanned the margins. Unconventional approach. Insufficient formal rigor. Lacks traditional structure. She read the comments twice. Her breathing stayed steady, but something inside her sharpened. Around her, the atmosphere was restless. That's harsh. He destroyed everyone. What did you get? Thea returned to her seat quietly. Hayes began the lecture as if nothing unusual had occurred. He did not look at her, not once, but she felt it. The message wasn't subtle. Yesterday's victory had been reframed. Today's narrative was correction. After class, students clustered near the exit. That quiz was impossible. Average must have been low. He's sending a message. Thea approached the desk once the room had emptied. Professor Hayes, she said calmly. He didn't look up immediately. Yes? I'd like clarification on the grading of problem 3. He adjusted his glasses. The comments are written. Yes, she replied evenly. But I'd like to understand what lacked rigor. He finally met her eyes. Miss Gibson, mathematics is not merely about reaching a conclusion. I agree. It is about how one arrives there. She nodded slightly. My derivation followed logically from the defined constraints. It followed your logic, he corrected. There it was again. Ownership. Authority. Are you suggesting it was incorrect? She asked. No, he said smoothly. I am suggesting it lacked traditional development. She held his gaze. Traditional, she repeated. Yes. A long pause. She chose her next words carefully. If the argument is sound, why does tradition determine its value? For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Irritation. Then control returned. Because, he said calmly, discipline ensures clarity across generations. She understood. This wasn't about clarity. It was about hierarchy. I see, she said quietly. He leaned back. You performed well last week, but consistency defines scholars. And a C- reflects inconsistency. It reflects development needed. The conversation had reached its boundary. Not resolution. Boundary. Thank you for your time, she said. She left the office. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual. Her scholarship required maintaining a high GPA. One low grade would not destroy it, but a pattern would. Later that afternoon, an email arrived. From the scholarship committee. Subject line, Academic Performance Review. Notice her chest tightened slightly. The message was formal. Due to recent grade fluctuations in advanced coursework, her scholarship status would be reviewed at the end of the term. No accusation, no conclusion. Just review. She closed the laptop slowly. Across campus, in his office, Hayes received a different email. From a colleague. Subject, strong student. The body contained a simple question. Are you mentoring her? Hayes stared at the screen. He did not reply. Instead, he opened her quiz again. He reread problem 3, then problem 1, then the conditional argument in problem 5. The work was not immature. It was independent. And independence, when it cannot be controlled, becomes threatening. He closed the folder. He told himself this was about standards, about protecting the integrity of his seminar. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. And control, once questioned publicly, demands restoration privately. The email from the scholarship office stayed open on Thea's screen long after the sun had gone down. Performance under review. The words were polite, administrative, but they carried weight. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair inside the university library. The large room was nearly empty now. Only the quiet hum of overhead lights and the soft turning of distant pages filled the space. If this was about performance, she would answer with performance. Not emotion, not protest. Performance. She opened Professor Hayes's 1993 paper, the one framed on his office wall, the one that had defined his early career, the paper that had secured his tenure. She had read it before, but now she read it differently, not as a student, as a critic. The paper dealt with convergence behavior under specific analytic constraints related to L functions. It was elegant, dense, widely cited, respected. She moved slowly through each section, line by line, not searching for revenge, searching for structure. 3 hours passed. Midnight approached. She reached a section discussing boundary conditions in a restricted domain. She paused. Read it again. There was an assumption, subtle, almost invisible. He assumed convergence under a parameter range that was never explicitly justified. She flipped back 3 pages, cross-referenced the lemma, then forward again. Her pulse quickened slightly. It wasn't an obvious mistake. It was a boundary case, a narrow range where the assumption might fail. She pulled out a separate notebook, reconstructed the proof independently, removed the assumption, recalculated the convergence, and there it was. Under one specific configuration, the convergence argument weakened, not catastrophic, not headline-grabbing, but real. She leaned back, stared at the ceiling. This wasn't an attack. It was mathematics, pure mathematics. But she understood the implications. If the assumption was unproven, the paper's central claim required clarification. She checked citations. Dozens of papers built upon this result. Her stomach tightened. If she was wrong, this would be embarrassing. If she was right, this was bigger than a classroom conflict. She did not rush. She rebuilt the argument twice, then a third time. By 2:15 a.m., her notebook contained a clean reconstruction and a clearly defined gap, not malicious, not fraudulent, just overlooked. She closed her eyes briefly. This wasn't something you announced casually. This was something you handled carefully, very carefully. The next morning, she drafted an email. Professional, measured, subject, clarification. Regarding 1993 convergence argument. She explained the boundary condition, outlined the potential gap, requested a meeting to discuss whether she had misunderstood the parameter assumption. No accusation, no tone, just mathematics. She reread it 3 times before sending. Then she clicked. Across campus, hours later, Hayes opened his inbox. He skimmed the subject line at first, then read the body more slowly. He straightened in his chair, scrolled back up, read it again. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. He opened the 1993 paper, flipped to the section she referenced. His jaw tightened. He reached for a notepad, rewrote the relevant argument quickly, checked the boundary. There it was, the narrow parameter case. He had considered it decades ago, dismissed it as negligible. He had never formally closed it. He leaned back slowly. The office felt smaller, not because of the gap, but because of who had found it. A first-year scholarship student, the same student whose work he had marked as lacking rigor. His chest tightened, not from fear, from something more complex. If she was correct, and she likely was, the correction would need to be addressed publicly, which meant acknowledgement, which meant visibility. He closed the paper, closed the email, and sat very still, because the situation had just changed. This was no longer about classroom hierarchy. This was about legacy. And legacy is the one thing men like Edmund Hayes protect above all else. The response did not come from Professor Hayes. It came from the dean. Thea was in the library again when her phone vibrated. An official university email notification. The subject line made her stomach tighten before she even opened it. Formal notice of academic misconduct review. For a moment, the words blurred. She blinked, read them again. Slowly. The message was brief and disturbingly neutral. Professor Edmund Hayes had filed a formal complaint alleging harassment, academic intimidation, and inappropriate professional conduct. The complaint stated that Thea Gibson had engaged in aggressive attempts to undermine published scholarship and had created a hostile academic environment through accusatory correspondence. Her breath stopped for half a second. Harassment? She replayed her email in her mind. It had been respectful, clinical, purely mathematical. She scrolled down. The notice also mentioned that concerns had been raised about the validity of her 10-minute classroom proof. It suggested the possibility of prior access to restricted materials or collaboration that had not been disclosed. Her chest tightened again. This wasn't just defense. This was escalation. Across campus, in an office lined with framed awards, Hayes sat quietly while speaking to Dean Richard Foster. "I have no issue with ambitious students," Hayes was saying evenly. "But boundaries matter. She is questioning foundational work in a manner that borders on misconduct." Dean Foster listened carefully. He was a cautious administrator, mid-50s, methodical. "She claims there's a gap," the dean said. "An alleged gap," Hayes corrected smoothly, "based on a selective interpretation of parameter behavior." "And the email?" "Inappropriate in tone." There was no anger in Hayes's voice, only precision. The dean leaned back. "And the classroom proof?" Hayes paused just long enough to appear thoughtful. "Highly unusual. I cannot confirm whether external assistance was involved." He did not accuse directly. He implied. Back in the library, Thea closed her laptop slowly. Her hands were steady. But inside, something was shifting. This was no longer academic disagreement. This was institutional pressure. She had one option: truth. She forwarded her original email to herself, checked the timestamps, attached her reconstructed notebook scans showing her independent derivation. Then she drafted a response to the dean. Professional, calm. She explained the boundary case, clarified that her email was intended as scholarly discussion, attached her full derivation of the gap, provided time-stamped documentation of her 10-minute proof preparation history, including her personal research notes dated months prior. She did not accuse Hayes of retaliation. She did not defend emotionally. She presented structure. Before sending, she paused. This could define her academic future. She clicked send. That evening, Hayes received a forwarded copy of her response. He read it slowly. Her tone was impeccable, her documentation thorough, and the attached notebook scans, dated weeks before the public challenge, demonstrated independent exploration of related symmetry arguments. He exhaled quietly. This was becoming complicated. What he had expected to be a containment maneuver was turning into scrutiny. Faculty politics were subtle. Reputation was currency. If this escalated publicly, it would not remain a student versus professor narrative. It would become a question of integrity. And he knew something else. Somewhere in the department, there were colleagues who had quietly suspected that the 1993 boundary case was underdeveloped. No one had pushed it. Until now. The next morning, Thea was called into the dean's office. The hallway felt unusually long. Inside, Dean Foster gestured for her to sit. His expression was not hostile, but it was serious. "Miss Gibson," he began, "this situation has become delicate." She nodded. "I understand. You're aware that Professor Hayes has raised concerns regarding your conduct?" "Yes." "And you stand by your analysis?" "I do." He studied her carefully. "You realize that challenging published work carries weight?" "I do," she repeated. "And if you are incorrect, then I accept correction." Her voice did not shake. Dean Foster folded his hands. "There is a visiting professor currently on campus, Dr. Patricia Coleman, Cambridge. She specializes in analytic number theory." Thea felt a slight shift in the air. "She has agreed," the dean continued, "to independently evaluate your claim." A pause. "And your classroom proof." Thea nodded once. Fair review. That was all she had ever asked for. But as she left the office, she understood something clearly. This was no longer about a grade, no longer about a recommendation letter. This had become a matter of academic truth. And truth, once questioned publicly, across the large oak table. Her 10-minute across the large oak table. Her 10-minute proof, her reconstruction of Hayes's 1993 boundary case, and the time-stamped derivations, everything, lay before her like an arsenal. The library was quiet. A few students typed at terminals. The soft hum of fluorescent lights and occasional page turning were the only sounds. Her phone buzzed. A calendar reminder. Meeting with Dean Foster, 10 a.m. She sat back. The day ahead would not be simple. Across campus, Hayes received a phone call. A colleague, low and cautious, mentioned that word of Thea's email had reached faculty gossip networks. The conversation was polite, careful, but it made Hayes tighten his grip on the phone. Every colleague who now questioned, even subtly, the integrity of his 1993 work was a potential threat. Hayes ended the call. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. The scholarship student, Thea Gibson, had exposed a flaw he had deliberately buried in footnotes decades ago. That she had done so respectfully and with documented derivations irritated him more than outright defiance ever could. Meanwhile, Thea packed her notes into a neat folder. She rehearsed the points she would make to the dean. Clear, precise, evidence-backed. No emotion, no accusation, just structure. By 9:45 a.m., she approached the dean's office. The corridor seemed unusually long, the sunlight sharp against polished tiles. She paused briefly outside the door, taking a slow breath, then entered. Dean Richard Foster, mid-50s, methodical and cautious, gestured for her to sit. He looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Miss Gibson," he began, "thank you for coming on short notice." She nodded. "I appreciate your time." He leaned back, folding his hands. "I've reviewed your correspondence and your attached derivations. Before proceeding, I need to make clear, challenging published work, particularly from a faculty member of Professor Hayes's stature, carries serious weight. Do you understand the implications?" "I do," Thea replied calmly. "I've documented everything. My goal is clarity, not confrontation." The dean nodded. "Very well. Dr. Patricia Coleman is visiting Whitmore this term. Analytic number theory, Cambridge. Highly respected. She has agreed to independently review your findings." Thea's pulse quickened slightly. This was exactly the fair evaluation she had hoped for. "Furthermore," the dean continued, "she will also assess the classroom proof you delivered in Professor Hayes's seminar. All materials will be reviewed in detail. Her report will determine the official stance of the department regarding your claims." Thea leaned back slightly. Fair, transparent. The truth would be assessed. Dean Foster studied her. "Do you understand that this process may attract attention, public or departmental?" "I do," she said. "I'm prepared for that." He nodded. "Good. Document everything meticulously as you have. Any gaps or errors identified by Dr. Coleman will be treated as part of scholarly review, not misconduct." Thea exhaled slowly. This was not a victory yet, but a chance, a proper platform for truth. She rose, thanked the dean, and left the office. Outside, the campus felt larger, brighter. Students walked past, oblivious to the unfolding academic tension. In her mind, she reviewed her approach to the 1993 boundary case. Every assumption, every derivation, every conditional step, ready for scrutiny. Meanwhile, Hayes sat in his office, unaware of the dean's arrangement. His inbox pinged again, another forwarded message from the department. "Independent review scheduled." A flash of unease passed through him. Not fear, that would be beneath him, but recognition. The scrutiny would not be controlled. The narrative was no longer his alone. He leaned back. Decades of reputation had taught him to calculate outcomes, but he had not anticipated a freshman approaching with precision, respect, and independence. Somewhere, quietly, the balance of authority had begun to shift. Thea returned to the library. Notes open, chalkboard sketches in her mind. She would continue her preparation. She could not control Hayes or departmental politics or whispers in faculty offices. But she could control her own work. And that work, rigorous, independent, undeniable, was all she needed. The next morning, Thea arrived early at the mathematics building. The halls were quiet, the echo of her footsteps a steady metronome for her thoughts. She carried her notebook, filled with the reconstruction of Hayes's 1993 paper and the printed scans of her 10-minute proof. Each page had been double-checked, every margin annotation time-stamped. Dean Foster had called her the previous evening to confirm that Dr. Patricia Coleman would review both her classroom demonstration and her boundary case analysis. Thea had spent the night reviewing her notes once more, ensuring every argument was clear, every assumption explicit. At exactly 9 a.m., she entered Dr. Coleman's office. Cambridge-trained, mid-40s, Coleman had an unassuming air, soft voice, warm eyes, but the weight of decades of research and publications radiated from her. "Miss Gibson," Coleman greeted, motioning to the chair across from her desk. "I've reviewed your email and your attached work. I want to see your process firsthand." Thea opened her notebook. She started methodically, tracing the assumptions Hayes had made in his 1993 paper, highlighting the boundary case and explaining her independent reconstruction. Every calculation was deliberate, every step rationalized. Coleman nodded slowly. "Impressive. Most students at this stage wouldn't even recognize the subtle gap, let alone rebuild the argument rigorously." Thea felt a flicker of satisfaction, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that recognition from authority was a currency best earned, not expected. Coleman's gaze drifted to her notes on the symmetry reduction and conditional proofs. "Your 10-minute seminar proof, I watched the recording. I see now that the approach was unconventional, yes, but mathematically sound. The logic is coherent and the framework is valid. The bounded verification holds." Thea's pulse quickened slightly, though her expression remained composed. The affirmation from Coleman was significant, but she knew Hayes's reaction could still overshadow it. Coleman continued, "I recommend that you document the derivation and boundary case analysis thoroughly. You may need to present this at a symposium or submit it for departmental review. Precision will be your safeguard." Thea nodded. She had anticipated this. She had already started drafting an extended framework, not just for the first 100 zeros, but a generalizable method that could later be applied to a wider set of Dirichlet L functions. They spent hours together. Coleman asked probing questions, challenging her assumptions, suggesting alternate approaches, and testing her reasoning. Each inquiry was incisive, but Thea responded with calm clarity. She could feel her confidence solidifying, layer by layer. By mid-afternoon, Coleman leaned back in her chair. "You've done more than merely identify a gap. You've proposed a structured way to correct it, and your seminar proof demonstrates creativity under pressure. This is rare for a student at your level." Thea allowed herself a small internal exhale. Rare, indeed. Coleman picked up her phone and sent a quick message. Moments later, an assistant appeared with a printed letter, addressed to Dean Foster, affirming the validity of Thea's analysis and confirming that her 10-minute proof was independently sound. "Keep this," Coleman said, handing the letter to Thea. "You may need it." Thea slipped the letter into her notebook. Every safeguard mattered. Hayes might still attempt to reinterpret her victory, reframe it, or question her methods. Coleman offered one final piece of advice before Thea left. "If Hayes challenges you further, remember, structure, clarity, and documentation will speak louder than emotion or rhetoric. Never assume intimidation is part of the mathematics, but do assume some will try to use it." Thea nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement. She had learned that lesson the hard way. As she walked down the hall toward the library, the sun breaking through clouds, her mind was already racing. There were emails to draft, calculations to refine, and a plan to present her work to the broader mathematical community. Every step she took now was preparation, not for class, not for Hayes, but for her own proof of competence and integrity. By the time she reached the library, she had decided she would continue her reconstruction, develop a generalized framework, and ensure that the upcoming symposium would leave no doubt about her capabilities. Hayes could challenge, dismiss, or attempt to undermine her, but she would be ready. And for the first time since the seminar, Thea felt something that had nothing to do with fear or frustration. Pooling over her notebook and printed scans. The pages were filled with equations, margin notes, and highlighted sections from Hayes's 1993 paper. Her approach was meticulous. She wasn't simply reviewing, she was cross-referencing every lemma, every corollary, every citation. She wanted absolute certainty before making any further claims. Hayes's complaint loomed over her, but Thea refused to let it dictate her process. Accuracy, clarity, and evidence would be her shield. By late morning, she began constructing the generalized framework she had envisioned the day before. The symmetry transformations from her seminar proof were expanded, conditions for bounded verification formalized, and assumptions explicitly stated. She introduced additional lemmas to handle edge cases that Hayes had overlooked in his original paper. Every step was documented with dates, timestamps, and references to supporting material. She imagined a panel of professors scrutinizing each line, Hayes, Coleman, the dean, and she wanted nothing to be ambiguous. Precision would leave no room for reinterpretation. Midday, a colleague from her seminar, a graduate student named Julian, approached quietly. He had watched the seminar proof and subsequent controversy unfold online. "Thea," he whispered, "everyone is talking about your 10-minute proof. Even outside the department, people are calling it revolutionary." Thea didn't look up immediately. "Revolutionary," she repeated softly. "It's mathematics, not publicity." Julian smiled, clearly impressed but cautious. "Still, you've changed the conversation. You've made Hayes rethink, and everyone else is paying attention." She closed her notebook briefly. "Attention isn't the point. Structure is. The proof holds because it's internally consistent, not because people are watching." He nodded slowly. "Right. But they are watching." By afternoon, she had completed the initial draft of her generalized derivation. She tested each boundary condition, ran the transformations against multiple Dirichlet characters, and verified the consistency of her conditional reductions. Notes filled the margins with observations, caveats, and potential extensions. Then she paused. Thea realized she was at a crossroads. She could submit this framework immediately to the department, but the timing was delicate. Hayes had already filed a complaint, and any formal submission might escalate the conflict before independent evaluation by Dr. Coleman. She decided on a measured course: document everything, keep her communications professional, and allow the independent review to proceed first. Evidence over impulse, discipline over reaction. By late afternoon, she drafted a summary of her findings. The language was formal, precise, devoid of emotion. Every assertion referenced prior derivations or her own reconstructed framework. She prepared the email, double-checked attachments, and scheduled it to be sent after she had reviewed it one final time. That evening, she closed her laptop. The library was nearly empty, the soft hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. She leaned back, stretching, feeling the weight of hours spent reconstructing decades-old mathematics. Her mind, however, was already considering the next steps: symposium preparations, broader generalizations, and the delicate navigation of departmental politics. Thea had learned one undeniable truth in the past 48 hours. Brilliance alone was not enough. She needed rigor, documentation, and strategy, and most of all, she needed patience. As she packed her notebooks and prepared to leave, she glanced out the library window. The campus was quiet, students moving in small clusters, unaware of the storm of scrutiny, calculation, and preparation happening within one corner of the mathematics building. For Thea, the real work was just beginning. The next morning, Thea arrived early at the mathematics department, carrying her notebook and a folder of printed derivations. The hallways were quiet, the kind of subdued stillness that felt charged with anticipation. Even without anyone speaking, she sensed the undercurrent of speculation. Students aware of the seminar incident, whispers lingering in every corner. She moved deliberately, not rushing, but aware of every step, every glance that might follow her. In the seminar room, Professor Hayes had already arrived. He sat at the front, reviewing papers, his posture impeccable as always. But there was something different today. A subtle tension lingered in the air around him, not in the way of anger or authority, something quieter but sharper. Thea noted it as she passed. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge her presence immediately. The seminar began with Hayes writing a few equations on the board, the usual air of precision and discipline filling the room. Students took notes, heads down, pens scratching paper. Thea found her seat and opened her notebook. She reviewed the last few steps of her generalized derivation quietly, ensuring every line remained fresh in her mind. Halfway through, the door opened, and Dr. Patricia Coleman entered. She carried herself with calm authority, a visiting professor from Cambridge, renowned in analytic number theory. She greeted Hayes and a few faculty members with formal nods, then moved to sit unobtrusively near the back. Her presence shifted the dynamic in the room. Even the graduate students in the back sat straighter, aware that evaluation was now not just theoretical, but tangible. Hayes paused mid-lecture. "Miss Gibson," he said, not looking at her, "you will have the floor shortly. Dr. Coleman will be observing your submitted derivation." The announcement was neutral, but the weight of it resonated. Every student recognized the stakes. The seminar continued, but the energy in the room had changed. Notes were taken more carefully, eyes occasionally flicking toward Thea, curiosity tempered by caution. After the lecture concluded, Hayes motioned for Thea to approach the board. She walked forward deliberately, placing her folder on the desk. Dr. Coleman observed silently, her notebook open, pen poised. Hayes gestured toward the chalkboard. "You may present the derivation, step by step." Thea took a deep breath. Her chalk made a soft scratch as she wrote the initial definitions. She began with the Dirichlet L-function framework, carefully noting the conditions, the symmetry constraints, and the bounded verification she had previously outlined. Her voice was calm, precise, measured. Every sentence was deliberate, every symbol chosen for clarity. She moved through the derivation methodically. Each transformation was annotated on the board, and she paused occasionally to explain assumptions and reference her reconstructed lemmas. Thea emphasized the edge cases she had identified, the narrow parameter conditions in Hayes's 1993 paper, and detailed the adjustments she had made to account for potential convergence gaps. Dr. Coleman's eyes flicked between the board, the folder, and Thea's notes. Occasionally, she would write in her notebook, sometimes pausing to reread a section. Thea was aware of the scrutiny, but she did not falter. Her focus remained on structure, on clarity, and on maintaining an impeccable chain of logic. Halfway through, Hayes interjected, not to criticize, but to clarify a term. "Miss Gibson, in equation 14, your notation differs slightly from standard use." "Yes, Professor," Thea replied evenly. "I adjusted it for internal consistency within the bounded framework. The transformation remains valid under these conditions." Hayes studied the board silently, a subtle nod acknowledging the logic. Dr. Coleman scribbled quickly, glancing up occasionally with what appeared to be genuine interest. The graduate students in the back shifted in their seats. Even the most confident among them seemed to recognize that this was not a simple presentation. It was an intellectual performance under the highest scrutiny. By the time Thea reached the conditional proofs of the edge cases, her chalk lines were precise, her explanations deliberate, her reasoning unassailable. She paused to allow the audience to absorb the implications of each mapping. There was no haste, no spectacle, only structure, only logic. When she finished, she stepped back. The board was filled with equations, annotations, and boxed lemmas. The room was silent. Hayes studied the board. Dr. Coleman put her pen down, reading through her own notes. For a long moment, the seminar hall held its breath. Finally, Dr. Coleman spoke. "Miss Gibson," she said, voice calm, precise, "your derivation is thorough. The identification of the boundary conditions and the conditional adjustments demonstrate independent analysis and rigor. It surpasses what would typically be expected at this stage." A murmur ran through the room. Even Hayes, usually unflappable, paused before responding. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the derivation line by line. There was acknowledgement in his gaze, restrained but unmistakable. "Your approach," he said finally, voice controlled, "is unconventional, but logically sound. The conditional proofs are defensible, and the boundary considerations are accurate." Thea nodded, maintaining her composure. No celebration, no triumph, only acknowledgement of the work completed. Dr. Coleman added, "I will include these observations in my independent evaluation. This level of analysis is exceptional." Hayes leaned back, thoughtful. "Miss Gibson, you may return to your seat." Thea walked back, her steps steady. The room seemed different now, charged not with tension or hierarchy, but with awareness. Students who had once merely observed now studied, measured, and considered. Hayes had regained his authority, yet a subtle shift had occurred. Even the most disciplined structures of reputation and hierarchy had been gently unsettled. As she collected her things, she understood one truth with clarity. Brilliance alone does not change institutions. Strategy, rigor, and patience do. And Thea had just demonstrated all three. Outside the seminar room, whispers spread immediately. Students discussed not just the proof, but the presence of Dr. Coleman, the validation, and the subtle acknowledgement from Hayes. Thea walked through the hallway, notebook tucked under her arm, awareness of every gaze, but no need for recognition. She had achieved what mattered: structure, clarity, and undeniable rigor. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore University Library, casting long, soft shadows across the polished wooden tables. Thea settled at her usual corner, notebook open, pencils sharpened, and laptop ready. Despite the subtle buzz from the seminar earlier, she maintained calm focus. There was work to do, and she knew the next step required precision rather than urgency. Her inbox had already received a short note from Dr. Patricia Coleman. Subject: preliminary observations. The message was polite, concise, and professional. "Your derivation demonstrates independent rigor. I will prepare a full assessment by week's end." It was validation, though tempered with formality. It mattered more than any comment from classmates or casual observers. It was from someone whose judgment carried weight far beyond the department. Yet Thea knew that institutional dynamics moved slower than clarity. Hayes remained a formidable figure, his reputation cemented over decades. Public acknowledgement, she understood, was one thing. Private assessment and strategic influence were another. Every email, every interaction, every seemingly trivial comment could subtly shift the narrative. Her goal was not confrontation. It was preservation of integrity and undeniable logic. She turned her attention back to her notebook. Weeks of preparatory work on the Dirichlet L functions had left her with a dense collection of lemmas, transformations, and computational notes. The recent events had only intensified her diligence. If the boundary conditions she had highlighted in Hayes's 1993 paper were accepted, it could ripple through a range of subsequent work. She worked systematically, checking assumptions, refining annotations, and cross-referencing each derivation with the original literature. A gentle rustle indicated someone approaching. She glanced up to see a graduate student, Marcus, from the second-year seminar. He moved with cautious curiosity. "Miss Gibson," he said quietly, leaning slightly toward her table. "I saw the classroom proof yesterday, and the evaluation today. That was impressive." "Thank you," she replied evenly, keeping her tone measured. "I appreciate the acknowledgement." Marcus hesitated. "Do you expect pushback?" She considered the question. Every institutional interaction carried risk, particularly when challenging established authority. "I expect scrutiny," she said finally. "Not resistance for its own sake. Scrutiny ensures clarity. That is what matters." Marcus nodded, understanding. He moved on, leaving Thea with her calculations and quiet focus. Every line she rewrote was deliberate. She reconstructed modular transformations, tested symmetry arguments, and verified computational bounds for the first 100 zeros. Her pen moved steadily, leaving behind a trail of structure and clarity. Hours passed. The library emptied. Thea paused briefly, stretching her shoulders and glancing around the near-empty room. She noticed small details she had overlooked in her early rush of thought. The subtle dependency of the L function on certain parameters, the edge case scenarios that could produce anomalies if unchecked, the consequences for related lemmas cited by Hayes's paper. Each observation reinforced the importance of thoroughness. By early evening, she had drafted a structured outline for a formal report. It included a step-by-step reconstruction, clear identification of the potential gap in Hayes's original argument, and her independent verification of the derived constraints. She annotated it carefully, ensuring every claim was traceable, every conclusion defensible. The report was precise, logical, and completely professional. When she finished, she reviewed it one more time. Her eyes traced the pages slowly, ensuring continuity, accuracy, and clarity. She saved the digital copy, printed a set for personal records, and organized her handwritten notes. This was not about confrontation, it was about documentation. The moment would come when careful record-keeping could protect not only her work, but the integrity of the field. Her phone vibrated, a notification from the scholarship committee. She opened it with deliberate calm. Subject: follow-up, academic performance review. The message was concise, outlining the continued evaluation of her recent work and noting the inclusion of external expert review. It emphasized impartial assessment and the procedural steps that would follow. There was no panic, no accusation, only formal structure. Thea leaned back, letting the weight of the day settle. She understood that her actions were being observed not only by Hayes, not only by Dr. Coleman, but by an entire web of academic scrutiny. Every derivation, every explanation, every email would be part of a larger narrative. Walking back to her dorm, Thea reflected on the seminar, Dr. Coleman's observation, and the messages from the scholarship office. She realized the situation had evolved beyond a single proof, a single quiz, or a single classroom encounter. It was now a question of accountability, of precision, and of documented excellence. She felt the familiar tension in her chest, not fear, but alertness, sharpened by responsibility. By the time she returned, evening had fallen. The library lights were dim, streets quiet, and her dorm room offered a rare moment of solitude. She reviewed the printed report again, highlighting key lines, noting assumptions, and tracing the derivation from start to finish. Every detail mattered. Every observation could become relevant. This was no longer about proving herself to Hayes. That challenge had passed. Now, the test was enduring scrutiny, documenting independence, and ensuring that mathematics itself remained the guiding principle. Brilliance alone could not navigate this landscape. Structure, rigor, and patience would determine the outcome. She closed her notebook with deliberate care. Tomorrow would bring emails, discussions, and possibly new challenges. But tonight, she understood one truth. In mathematics, as in life, clarity and persistence were their own form of defense, and she had both. Thea woke early the next morning. The campus was quiet, almost too quiet, as though the university itself was holding its breath. She sipped coffee slowly in her small dorm room, reviewing her notes again, checking each lemma, every calculation, every annotation. Precision mattered more than speed. Every day brought a new layer of scrutiny, and she was determined to remain ahead of it. By mid-morning, she found herself walking toward the mathematics department, her steps measured. She noticed a few familiar faces in the hallways. Some students glanced her way, curiosity in their eyes. Others looked away, uncertain how to react. Yesterday's classroom proof had circulated quietly among seminar participants, the whispers of, "Did you see that?" still echoing subtly in shared corridors. Inside her usual seminar room, Hayes was already present, standing near the chalkboard with a stack of papers in his hands. His expression was neutral, composed, but Thea could feel the weight of his observation as soon as she stepped inside. He acknowledged her presence with a subtle nod, then returned to reviewing the papers, the quiet authority of decades of experience radiating from him. "Good morning, Miss Gibson," he said finally, his tone measured. "I hope your review preparations are progressing." "Yes, Professor Hayes," she replied evenly. "I've been reviewing the symmetry arguments and boundary constraints we discussed." He nodded, letting the words hang in the air. There was an unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement that the previous week's events had altered the usual dynamic. Hayes cleared his throat. "Today, we will proceed with the seminar as scheduled. However, I have included a brief exercise at the start, 5 minutes each, to assess clarity under immediate problem-solving conditions." Thea accepted the sheet when it was passed to her, noting the first glance of the problem set. They were high-level questions, each demanding both knowledge and careful reasoning. Not impossible, but designed to test composure as much as skill. She recognized the structure. Hayes was calibrating the pressure, ensuring her approach could withstand multiple layers of scrutiny. As the seminar commenced, she worked through the problems methodically. Every line of her reasoning was deliberate. The classroom was silent except for the soft scratching of pens, the occasional turn of a page, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Hayes moved between rows, observing, occasionally adjusting his glasses, eyes narrowing slightly at complex derivations. She felt no panic. She had rehearsed rigor in her mind, constructing each argument from first principles, ensuring that the foundation of her reasoning was unshakable. Problem 1 required modular transformation verification. She drafted it neatly, outlining assumptions and intermediate steps. Problem 2 demanded a subtle exploration of L-function symmetry, which she reduced to a manageable framework using conditional reasoning. By the third problem, Thea noticed subtle glances from the back rows. Graduate students whispered softly, their curiosity evident. She maintained her focus, aware that performance in Hayes's seminar was not only about the correctness of answers, but also about composure under observation. The stakes were not grades alone, they were perception, reputation, and the weight of authority in the academic environment. 30 minutes passed. Thea completed 4 problems fully, documenting every step. The 5th, the most abstract, she outlined with conditional logic, ensuring that her reasoning remained defensible while acknowledging boundaries in the assumptions. When the bell marked the end of the exercise, she quietly set her pen down, exhaled, and awaited the next step. Hayes collected the sheets without comment, his eyes briefly meeting hers. There was no immediate feedback, no outward approval, yet Thea sensed the subtle assessment, the silent measurement of her clarity, logic, and independence. The seminar continued. The regular lecture material resumed, yet the atmosphere had shifted. Other students were attentive in a new way, measuring both the professor and the scholarship student whose reasoning had disrupted familiar expectations. After class, Thea lingered briefly, reviewing her solutions and double-checking annotations. She could feel the weight of observation even in the absence of direct scrutiny. In Problem 5, it is precise, though in Problem 5, it is precise, though unconventional. Yes, Professor, she replied calmly. I wanted to ensure clarity without overstepping the assumptions. He regarded her for a long moment. Your approach demonstrates understanding beyond typical undergraduate expectations. That said, he added carefully, independence requires consistency. Moments of insight are valuable, but only when reinforced systematically. She nodded, recognizing the balance in his words. Hayes did not offer praise. He offered perspective. Discipline, structure, and consistent performance were as crucial as the brilliance that could spark from independent reasoning. She understood. She had won a battle in logic, but the campaign demanded sustained rigor. Later that afternoon, Thea returned to the library, organizing notes from the morning exercise. She annotated every step, ensuring reproducibility, clarity, and coherence. Her focus was unwavering. This was not simply preparation for an immediate assessment. It was documentation of methodology, an archive of reasoning that could withstand institutional review. As evening fell, she paused to reflect. The dynamic with Hayes had shifted subtly. Yesterday, she had demonstrated capability. Today, she had demonstrated consistency under observation. Each day required renewed attention, careful navigation of authority, and meticulous work. Her scholarship, her academic reputation, and her personal integrity were intertwined. She had learned that brilliance alone could provoke scrutiny, but rigor and documentation could establish credibility. Thea understood that the work ahead would be measured not only by correctness, but also by precision, strategy, and patience. She closed her notebook and laptop, feeling the weight of responsibility balanced with the satisfaction of structured accomplishment. Outside, the campus lights glimmered softly. In the quiet of her room, Thea felt a growing clarity. Her path was not defined by confrontation, but by persistent, unshakable adherence to truth. Mathematics, she reminded herself, was both a battlefield and a sanctuary. Insight mattered, but structure, patience, and consistency, these were what endured. Thea's next week began with a sense of careful calculation. She moved through her schedule deliberately, balancing seminar attendance, independent study, and quiet reflection. Each step was measured. Every conversation with peers and faculty was filtered through awareness. She knew that perception mattered as much as correctness, and that in the corridors of Whitmore University, subtle actions often carried louder consequences than bold statements. In the seminar that afternoon, Professor Hayes took his place at the front once again. He began the lecture without reference to the previous exercise, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Thea noted this, understanding that Hayes's strategy was layered. Public acknowledgement had been minimized, but private assessment had likely intensified. The shift in dynamics was subtle but palpable. Students whispered quietly among themselves, glancing occasionally at Thea, curious, cautious, even slightly wary. Hayes launched into a discussion on analytic continuation, carefully walking through contour integration techniques. He chose his examples with precision, illustrating principles with clarity, yet he never lingered on the extraordinary demonstration from the prior week. It was as if he was creating a controlled environment, emphasizing rigorous technique over individual performance, perhaps testing whether the momentum of yesterday's proof would sustain itself under normal expectations. Thea followed each step closely, her notebook open, recording observations and computations. She did not raise her hand unnecessarily, even when a point seemed ambiguous. Patience, she knew, was often a stronger statement than interruption. Occasionally, Hayes glanced her way, eyes scanning, measuring not the content of her notes but the steadiness of her engagement, the clarity of her comprehension. During a brief break, she noticed a group of graduate students discussing her 10-minute proof quietly in a corner. Words like ingenious, unconventional, and bold were spoken in hushed tones. She smiled faintly, recognizing that reputation was a shifting entity, a conversation in motion. She returned to her notes calmly, understanding that attention and reflection mattered more than external commentary. After the seminar concluded, Hayes remained at the chalkboard, erasing equations slowly, deliberately. His movements were precise, almost meditative. When Thea approached, he did not immediately speak. She waited, respecting his measured timing. "Miss Gibson," he said finally, voice quiet, neutral. "I've reviewed your previous submission and exercise sheets in detail." "Yes, Professor Hayes," she replied. "You demonstrate technical capacity," he continued. "Your reasoning is independent, and your methods reflect insight. However," he paused, letting the word hang, "insight alone does not equate to mastery. Consistency, clarity of process, and methodological adherence are required to translate capability into lasting scholarship." She nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement without argument. Hayes's words were not criticism in the traditional sense. They were a framework for understanding, a reminder that authority measured achievement not only by correctness, but by replicable, disciplined reasoning. "Tomorrow," he added, "we will introduce a timed analytical exercise. It will test both comprehension and composure under structured evaluation. This is not punitive. It is preparatory. Your past performance indicates that you are capable, but capable scholars demonstrate reliability in multiple contexts." Thea absorbed the information quietly. She understood the layered purpose: assessment, observation, preparation, and subtle recalibration of hierarchy. She thanked him, noting the precision in his guidance. Then she left the seminar room, her posture composed, notebook secure under her arm. That evening, she settled in the library to prepare. Her approach was methodical: review foundational principles, cross-reference previous exercises, reconstruct arguments from first principles, and practice translating insight into structured demonstration. Each step was documented meticulously. She did not rush. She would not rely on inspiration alone. She would rely on preparation, structure, and a disciplined execution of knowledge. Hours passed in the quiet hum of the library. Occasionally, she glanced at the clock, not out of panic, but to calibrate pacing. Thea knew the upcoming exercise would measure not only her understanding, but also her ability to perform under scrutiny. She could anticipate Hayes's strategy: layered problems, subtle constraints, and pressure designed to test both depth and composure. By late evening, she had constructed a comprehensive set of notes, balancing theoretical exploration with applied calculations. She reviewed them carefully, verifying each step, correcting minor inconsistencies, and clarifying assumptions. She documented each derivation and linked every conclusion to its logical foundation. This was more than preparation. It was a declaration of method, a demonstration that reasoning could be both independent and disciplined. As she packed her materials, she reflected on the nature of her interactions with Hayes. Yesterday, she had proven capability. Today, she had demonstrated consistency and composure. Tomorrow, she would demonstrate resilience under structured pressure. Each layer mattered. Each moment was part of a broader narrative, a narrative of scholarship, independence, and the negotiation of authority. She closed her notebook, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Mathematics was more than equations and proofs. It was an exercise in patience, precision, and perception. She understood the stakes. Her scholarship, her reputation, and her academic trajectory were intertwined with every decision she made. But she also understood something else, that in truth and discipline there was power, and she intended to wield it carefully, deliberately, and with clarity. The next morning, Thea arrived at the mathematics seminar with a quiet sense of focus. She had reviewed her notes, double-checked her derivations, and rehearsed her approach to structured problem-solving. Every detail mattered. Every step she took was intentional, measured, precise. Her notebook, filled with clean derivations and annotated assumptions, was tucked neatly in her bag. She did not rush. She did not linger. She moved with purpose, understanding that in environments like Whitmore University, presence alone communicated attention, respect, and discipline. Professor Hayes entered the lecture hall at the scheduled hour. There was no preamble, no acknowledgement of the prior week's events. He carried a fresh stack of problem sheets, his expression neutral, unreadable. He placed them on the desk, sliding them down the rows with practiced efficiency. The students followed suit, reaching for the papers, exchanging quiet glances. The atmosphere was tense, but measured. "This exercise," Hayes began, voice calm, precise, "is designed to evaluate multiple dimensions of your analytical capacity, understanding, composure, and application under structured constraints." He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle over the room. "You will have 45 minutes. No collaboration, no external reference materials. Completion is secondary to methodical reasoning." Thea glanced at the first problem. It was immediately clear that Hayes had escalated the challenge. Multi-layered derivations, subtle conditional assumptions, and constraints that required careful management of both computational and logical pathways. The problems were not impossibly abstract, but they demanded rigor, discipline, and composure under pressure. She began with a methodical approach, scanning the page, identifying variables, and structuring a roadmap. She was deliberate. Each assumption was noted, each transformation cross-checked. She did not rush. She understood the implicit lesson embedded in Hayes's escalation. The goal was not to impress with speed, but to demonstrate structured, replicable reasoning. Around her, students scribbled frantically, some visibly anxious. Thea remained calm. Every few minutes, she glanced at her internal clock, gauging pacing against complexity. She moved sequentially through the problems, leaving none unaddressed. When a particularly intricate elliptic curve L-function calculation appeared, she paused briefly, rewrote the relevant expression in a simplified, equivalent form, and applied symmetry arguments she had rehearsed. Her derivation was neither flashy nor performative. It was precise, structured, replicable. Hayes moved silently between rows, observing, scanning, measuring. He paused beside a few students, nodding or frowning subtly, then moved on. When he reached Thea, he lingered slightly longer. Her notebook displayed an elegant balance of independent insight and disciplined methodology. She had anticipated the pressure, anticipated the need for clarity, and had responded with both. Hayes's eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in calculation. 30 minutes in, the tension in the room had thickened. Several students had paused, pencils hovering, indecision written across their faces. Thea continued steadily, documenting each step, highlighting constraints, annotating assumptions, and constructing a logical flow. Her composure was quiet, measured, and deliberate. It was not a display of confidence for others to see. It was the discipline of someone fully engaged with the task, someone who understood the stakes yet did not succumb to spectacle. When the final minutes approached, she turned to the last problem, a conditional derivation requiring multi-step reasoning across variable domains. She outlined her argument carefully, noting the assumptions, constraints, and implications. She boxed intermediate results, ensuring clarity of logic. Then, with 2 minutes remaining, she verified each calculation, checked the symmetry constraints, and confirmed that the conclusions followed logically. She laid her pen down with precision, her work complete. Hayes collected the papers silently, stacking them carefully, his expression unreadable. The students filed out, some whispering, some quietly frustrated, others uncertain. Thea remained seated for a moment, absorbing the atmosphere. There was no immediate acknowledgement, no applause, nothing to suggest victory. Only a quiet awareness that methodical discipline had been exercised and observed. Later that afternoon, Hayes began marking the papers. He worked efficiently, noting completion, clarity, and correctness. Most submissions reflected haste, over-reliance on rote procedures, and minor errors. Thea's paper, by contrast, exhibited rigor, clarity, and independent reasoning. Each step was documented, each assumption explicit. The solution demonstrated insight within disciplined methodology. Hayes paused, reflecting on the consistency and precision. He noted her work as exemplary in compositional structure, the type of paper he would expect from a student with both potential and disciplined execution. Yet, as before, he applied his measure of authority. Marks were calibrated not merely for correctness, but for adherence to convention, clarity, and reproducibility. The final grade reflected this balance, high yet tempered, indicating recognition tempered by structural evaluation. It was a lesson in both achievement and continued growth. Thea received her graded paper the following morning. She noted the comments: strong, independent reasoning, methodical execution, maintain consistency. No exclamation, no praise beyond professional acknowledgement. She read carefully, internalized the feedback, and returned her notebook to her bag. There was satisfaction in accomplishment, but also understanding. The measure of true scholarship was not a single success. It was sustained discipline, insight, and methodical execution. Walking out of the seminar hall, she understood that Hayes's strategy was deliberate. Every escalation, every observation, every calibrated grade served a broader purpose. It was not simply about assessment. It was about shaping understanding, reinforcing methodical rigor, and testing composure under structured pressure. And she was ready to meet each challenge, step by step, with clarity, patience, and precision. The day after receiving her graded seminar paper, Thea returned to the library, not out of anxiety, but with a clear sense of purpose. She had reflected on Professor Hayes's grading and the comments he had left. Strong, independent reasoning, methodical execution, maintain consistency. It was recognition, yes, but measured and guarded. A reminder that her progress would always be evaluated in the context of discipline, structure, and tradition. That was the environment she had entered, and she understood it fully. Sitting at her usual corner desk, Thea opened her notebook. She began reviewing her work systematically, problem by problem. While her reasoning had been validated, she knew that excellence was not static. Mastery demanded refinement, repetition, and anticipation of unseen variables. She examined each derivation, rechecked every assumption, and looked for any subtle simplifications or improvements. This exercise was not about contesting the grade. It was about internalizing precision and preparing for future evaluations that would surely be more demanding. Around her, the library hummed quietly. Students whispered softly, pages turned, computers clicked. Yet in that calm, Thea felt a heightened sense of awareness. Every detail mattered. The construction of her arguments, the logic of her transformations, the notation she chose, all communicated discipline without words. She understood that in academic spaces dominated by hierarchy and reputation, Subtlety often carried more weight than bold statements. Across campus, Professor Hayes sat in his office, reviewing the submissions from the seminar. He had started with a sense of expectation, an internal framework of what was standard, predictable, and manageable. Most papers conformed to the patterns he anticipated. They reflected textbook comprehension, rote procedure, and conventional reasoning. Then there was Thea's. He examined her arguments again, line by line. The consistency, clarity, and independence of thought were evident. And yet the work was unconventional. It adhered to principles but bypassed traditional presentation, challenging the conventions he valued without violating them. Hayes's mind calculated quietly, weighing recognition against authority. Publicly, he had to maintain the structure of the seminar. Privately, he acknowledged the rare presence of genuine insight, independent reasoning, and analytical discipline. This realization carried a subtle tension. Hayes was used to shaping, controlling, and measuring the narrative in his classroom. Rarely did a student arrive who required recalibration, who could execute independent reasoning without supervision and do so visibly and accurately. It was an anomaly he could neither ignore nor easily assimilate into his pre-existing hierarchy. Thea had introduced uncertainty, not through defiance, but through structured intellect. Meanwhile, Thea's day continued in methodical fashion. She reviewed research papers cited in Professor Hayes's 1993 work, analyzing assumptions and cross-referencing derivations. Her goal was not confrontation, but comprehension. Understanding the foundations of existing scholarship allowed her to navigate her own reasoning with clarity. She meticulously documented discrepancies, boundary cases, and assumptions that were implicit rather than explicit. Each note was carefully dated and cross-referenced, building a comprehensive framework that reinforced her methodology. By mid-afternoon, her review was complete. She had constructed a synthesis of insights from her prior work, her seminar derivations, and the foundational papers of analytic number theory she had revisited. The result was a coherent, self-contained structure that demonstrated independent analytical reasoning while remaining compatible with established scholarship. She knew the value of documentation. Time-stamped notes, annotated derivations, and careful explanation created a record of intellectual honesty and clarity. Hayes, across campus, had begun a subtle recalibration. He reviewed departmental communications, discussions with colleagues, and the recent chain of student submissions. He recognized patterns emerging. Thea's work was consistent, rigorous, and above the undergraduate standard. Yet he also recognized a potential threat: visibility. When intelligence operates independently, it draws attention, challenges assumptions, and shifts hierarchies. Recognition could not be denied. Control could not be fully restored. Hayes's intellect, meticulous and deliberate, began planning. Sensed the shifting dynamics indirectly. Her focus remained on scholarship, not politics. Every derivation she examined, every transformation she calculated, and every note she recorded reinforced the principle that clarity, precision, and discipline were her most powerful tools. She recognized that influence, respect, and authority were byproducts of consistent intellectual rigor. One seminar victory or a single graded paper could not define her standing. Only sustained performance, documented and verified, would secure her place. As evening approached, she prepared a concise summary of her notes and insights. It was not a challenge to Hayes or the department. It was structured documentation of exploration, reasoning, and conclusions. The submission would serve as a reference, an illustration of disciplined inquiry. Carefully typed, formatted, and reviewed, it became an artifact of methodical scholarship rather than spectacle. Back in his office, Hayes reviewed the departmental memos again. He paused over Thea's seminar paper, re-examining each step, each unconventional argument, and the implications for teaching, hierarchy, and scholarly recognition. He understood that the upcoming months would not be ordinary. Every interaction, every evaluation, and every observation would be measured. Authority, once questioned publicly, required careful calibration. He would not act impulsively. Instead, he would observe, measure, and respond with calculated precision. For Thea, the path forward was equally clear. Excellence demanded not only insight but consistency. Independence demanded not only creativity but discipline. And in the quiet of the library, she understood that the real work had only just begun. Sustained, methodical, and deliberate scholarship, executed with clarity and patience, would define the trajectory of her academic future. The next morning, Thea arrived at Whitmore University's mathematics building earlier than usual. The corridors were quiet, the air crisp with early spring. She carried only her notebook, a tablet, and a pen, essentials for focused work, free from distractions. She wasn't anxious. The prior events had sharpened her awareness, honed her instincts, and clarified the stakes. She understood that the coming weeks would be less about immediate triumphs and more about demonstrating sustained, verifiable scholarship. As she entered the seminar hall, she noticed subtle changes. Students whispered in small groups, casting glances toward her. Phones were tucked away more deliberately, and the usual restless energy felt dampened. There was a tangible acknowledgement, unspoken, indirect, that something had shifted. Yesterday's 10-minute proof, the graded paper, and the subsequent scrutiny had altered the dynamic. Thea walked to her usual seat, not to flaunt her presence, but to anchor herself in familiar territory. Professor Hayes entered shortly after, carrying a stack of unmarked problem sets. His expression was neutral, his pace deliberate. He placed the papers on the desk and began speaking in measured tones. Today, we continue with standard exercises, though I expect precision and adherence to conventional structure, he said. His gaze swept the room. Students nodded silently, many adjusting their posture, pencils poised. The tension was subtle, but persistent. Thea's attention remained on the board. While the lecture began with routine derivations, she followed carefully, noting minor details, cross-referencing formulas with prior knowledge, and considering alternative methods. Her approach was analytical and deliberate. She observed that Hayes was subtly adjusting examples, slightly more complex than usual, testing comprehension across the room. It wasn't a trap in the classical sense, but a calibration of performance under observation. Throughout the hour, Thea engaged fully, contributing when appropriate, but never for spectacle. When Hayes posed a challenging question about the distribution of zeros under specific modular constraints, she outlined her reasoning quietly, step by step, demonstrating understanding without attempting to impress. Her clarity contrasted with some graduate students' rushed attempts at performance. Hayes noticed. He remained calm, yet the subtle shifts in his expression betrayed the internal calculation. She was consistent, precise, and independent. By mid-morning, the seminar transitioned into collaborative exercises. Students were paired for discussions on L-function behaviors and complex variable transformations. Some partners struggled with foundational assumptions, requiring repeated explanations. Thea, however, approached her assigned partner methodically, guiding through logical steps rather than supplying answers. Her influence was quiet, controlled, and rooted in reasoned explanation. Hayes observed from a distance, noting her interactions, yet refraining from immediate commentary. The observation was deliberate. Independence under peer engagement was as informative as performance under direct examination. After the exercises concluded, Hayes introduced an unscheduled problem set. 5 questions, each escalating in complexity and depth. Students murmured, apprehensive, some glancing at each other for reassurance. Thea's pulse remained steady. She scanned each problem systematically, identifying key variables, constraints, and possible transformations. This approach was habitual now, reinforced by prior experience with high-pressure, high-stakes evaluation. She began outlining solutions, carefully structuring each argument, explicitly noting assumptions, and preemptively addressing potential critiques. Time passed quickly. She remained composed, her work methodical. Hayes moved among the rows intermittently, observing without comment, evaluating performance patterns. Some students completed 2 problems, some none. Thea systematically completed 3 and outlined the remaining 2 with conditional reasoning, leaving comprehensive notes on the thought process. By the time the set was collected, the tension in the room was palpable. Students whispered quietly, some casting furtive glances toward her desk. Hayes simply stacked the papers, expression neutral, eyes thoughtful. Later, Thea returned to the library. She reviewed her solutions, not for reassurance, but for refinement. She compared her reasoning to references, ensuring consistency and correctness, while noting subtle variations in approach that could later be defended in academic discourse. Her understanding deepened with every iteration, and her methodology became more precise, more structured, and more defensible. Meanwhile, Hayes reflected privately. His expectations had been challenged, not dramatically, but subtly and persistently. Thea's consistency, independence, and rigorous approach were unmistakable. He acknowledged internally that one public victory was insufficient for redefinition, yet the pattern of her performance demanded acknowledgement. Private notes, structured observations, and subtle recalibrations began to accumulate in his mind. The balance between authority and recognition was delicate, yet increasingly complex. By mid-afternoon, Thea had prepared a summary of her work, outlining assumptions, transformations, and conditional derivations. She intended to submit it to Hayes not as a challenge, but as structured documentation, evidence of independent reasoning, intellectual discipline, and methodological rigor. Her tone was professional, precise, and restrained. Every step reflected her commitment to accuracy over spectacle, clarity over drama. Hayes received her submission later that evening. He reviewed it carefully, line by line, noting precision, logical consistency, and thoroughness. Her work was methodical, defensible, and, importantly, independent. Thea had managed to construct arguments that navigated tradition while asserting clarity and reason. Hayes allowed himself a brief acknowledgement of the subtle shift. Independent thought, consistently demonstrated, commanded attention even within a rigid academic hierarchy. In that quiet moment, both student and professor understood the evolving dynamic. Recognition, authority, and intellectual hierarchy were in motion. Excellence demanded consistency, independence demanded discipline, and visibility, once achieved, required both acknowledgement and careful navigation. For Thea, the lesson was clear. Sustained performance and methodological rigor would define her place. For Hayes, the lesson was equally stark. Authority, while resilient, required careful observation and thoughtful response when confronted with genuine intellect. The seminar, the graded paper, and the unscheduled problem set were no longer isolated incidents. They were threads in a broader narrative, a story of rigor, observation, and adaptation. And for both Thea Gibson and Professor Edmund Hayes, the coming weeks would be a delicate balance of verification, recognition, and strategic discipline. The following week, the campus felt charged with subtle anticipation. Students whispered in hallways, coffee cups trembled in hands more from nerves than caffeine, and the seminar hall seemed almost heavier than usual. Thea Gibson arrived early, carrying her notebook and tablet as always, her posture calm, her expression focused. She understood that the scrutiny she faced was no longer about a single proof, a single grade, or even a single class. Room. She noticed the students already gathering, talking quietly, some with furrowed brows, others attempting casual conversation to mask unease. Thea's presence elicited subtle acknowledgement, nods, slight glances, but nothing overt. That was expected. Attention could be subtle yet palpable, attention that hovered without words. She found her seat, organized her materials, and opened her notebook to review yesterday's derivations. Professor Hayes entered promptly, carrying a fresh set of problem sheets. His movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, signaling both control and expectation. "Today," he said, voice steady, "we will explore advanced applications of zero-density estimates and L-function distributions. Please prepare to work independently." His eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on Thea. The subtle focus was not intimidation, but measurement. Every action in Hayes's classroom was carefully calibrated, and he was observing her reaction. The first 30 minutes passed with standard derivations and explanations, though the examples were more complex than usual. Thea followed each step, making notes, mentally cross-referencing previous results, and constructing small alternative approaches to each derivation. Hayes introduced incremental challenges, minor adjustments to parameters, subtle shifts in assumptions, all designed to test whether students were merely repeating knowledge or actively engaging with it. Thea responded methodically. She maintained composure, careful notation, and structured reasoning. Her work was precise, measured, and independent. Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly at one of her margin notes, a subtle acknowledgement of her analytical depth. Midway through the session, Hayes introduced an unscheduled mini-assessment, 3 problems requiring application of previously discussed principles under modified constraints. Students exchanged nervous glances. Whispers surfaced briefly before fading. Thea approached the set systematically. She analyzed the constraints first, outlined assumptions, and noted potential boundary conditions. Each step was justified. Each transformation accounted for logical consistency. She began solving with a calm determination, aware that this exercise was as much about method as outcome. Hayes walked between rows, observing silently. Some students panicked under pressure, scribbling quickly, skipping steps, or attempting shortcuts. Thea moved deliberately, one line of reasoning at a time, ensuring clarity and defensibility in her derivations. The air in the room seemed to contract and expand with each movement. The faint scratch of pencil, the shifting of chairs, the occasional cough, all amplified against a background of focused silence. Hayes's gaze lingered longer at her desk than anyone else's. He was evaluating consistency, whether yesterday's brilliance was repeatable, whether independence could withstand scrutiny. By the 20-minute mark, the first problem was complete. Thea paused briefly, reviewing each step, confirming that assumptions were documented and calculations verified. She then tackled the second problem with the same meticulous process, outlining intermediate results clearly, noting exceptions, and framing conditional reasoning without overstatement. Students around her faltered, seeking reassurance from peers or textbooks. She remained centered, her focus on process rather than reaction. Hayes took note of her posture and approach, recognizing patterns that went beyond raw intellect, discipline, awareness, and methodical independence. The third problem was the most challenging, demanding creative application of modular transformations and zero-boundary arguments. Many students froze, unsure of how to proceed. Thea analyzed the problem, identified key symmetries, and applied a framework similar to her 10-minute proof, carefully documenting each transformation. Her derivation was conditional, explicit, and logically consistent. Hayes observed quietly from the back of the room, noting the precision and independence of her reasoning. He made subtle margin notes on his own pad, observations, evaluations, possible refinements. 40 minutes later, the papers were collected. Students filed out slowly, exchanging uncertain glances, whispers, and occasional frustrated sighs. Thea left calmly, reviewing her work one last time in her notebook before securing her tablet. The seminar hall emptied, but the sense of observation lingered. Hayes remained at his desk, silent, calculating. One student's paper confirmed expectations. Another reflected panic. Hers, however, demonstrated methodical independence. He allowed himself a brief acknowledgement, internal, private, that she was performing at a level that required careful attention. Later that afternoon, Thea returned to the library. She reviewed each derivation, comparing with references, noting subtle differences, and preparing questions for her own reflection. Her goal was not to prove herself to anyone externally, but to ensure that her reasoning remained consistent, defensible, and grounded in logic. She highlighted conditional assumptions, refined calculations, and drafted marginal notes on alternative approaches for each problem. Her independence, once an assertion, was now a disciplined practice. Meanwhile, Hayes reflected in his office. The pattern emerging in Thea's performance was undeniable. Yesterday's C-, intended to enforce hierarchy and authority, had not disrupted consistency. Her methodical, precise, and independent approach now demanded acknowledgement. He recognized that control, while essential, had limits when faced with genuine intellect. Observations accumulated in his notebook, attention to detail, clear documentation, defensible conditional reasoning, and consistent performance under pressure. This was no fluke. By evening, emails circulated among faculty, subtly acknowledging the unusual consistency and independence in her work. Hayes received several, polite and neutral, noting curiosity rather than judgment. He did not respond. His own reflections were deeper. He considered implications for the seminar, departmental standards, and his own position. Independence, once tolerated, now required careful recalibration. Thea, seated in the library under the dim glow of her desk lamp, summarized her observations from the week. She recognized that performance, rigor, and sustained consistency mattered more than any singular victory. The lesson was clear. Intellectual independence, methodical reasoning, and disciplined engagement were the tools for navigating not only mathematics, but academic structures. And for Hayes, recognition of this independence was unavoidable, subtle though it remained. The dynamic between student and professor had shifted. Hierarchies remained, but they were now tempered by observation, performance, and consistent, verifiable scholarship. Both understood the stakes. For Thea, a path defined by logic and independence. For Hayes, the recalibration of authority in the face of demonstrated competence. The final week of the term arrived with a quiet intensity that seemed to hang over Whitmore University like a taut string ready to snap. Students moved through the halls with a heightened awareness, whispers circulating in hushed tones, not just about grades, but about Thea Gibson. Her 10-minute proof, the unscheduled quiz, and the independent derivations had become part of the campus's internal lore. Graduate students paused to glance at her in passing, undergraduates whispered behind hands, and faculty subtly noted her consistency. She had become a presence in the academic landscape, one that could no longer be ignored. Thea arrived at the seminar hall early. The room was empty, but she could feel the latent expectation in the polished wood, the faint echo of past discussions, the weight of previous week's scrutiny. She took her usual seat, opened her notebook, and began reviewing her derivations one final time, cross-referencing every step, every assumption, every boundary case. Precision was not enough. She needed clarity and defensibility, both for herself and for the record. Hayes entered moments later, carrying the final exam papers. His posture was upright, his expression neutral, but Thea sensed the subtle shift. Observation had given way to anticipation. Measurement was now assessment. "Good morning," Hayes said evenly. His eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on her. "This is the final assessment. 5 problems, advanced applications, 45 minutes, work independently." The phrasing was simple, almost clinical, but the underlying message was clear. This was the culmination of weeks of scrutiny, the moment where consistency, independence, and understanding would be measured under controlled conditions. Thea approached the first problem with calm precision. It demanded the application of conditional L-function arguments within a modular framework she had been developing since the first class. She outlined assumptions, noted boundary cases, and documented each step meticulously. Hayes circulated quietly, observing subtle movements, pencil lines, margin notes, small adjustments to the structure of her derivation. Other students scribbled frantically, some whispering questions to themselves, some abandoning steps midstream. Thea's notebook reflected clarity, structure, and defensible reasoning. By the 20-minute mark, she had completed 3 problems. She paused briefly to review each derivation, checking for logical consistency and internal coherence. Problem 4 presented a challenge that many would hesitate to attempt: a composite application of symmetry arguments across multiple L functions with constraints rarely discussed in lecture. Thea approached it analytically, breaking the problem into manageable subcases. She noted conditional steps, referenced prior derivations, and maintained a clear chain of reasoning. Hayes's gaze lingered longer than before, as if assessing the reproducibility of yesterday's performance. The final problem, number 5, demanded creative insight. It required linking abstract modular structures with explicit zero-boundary constraints in a context she had not encountered before. Many students stared blankly, unable to reconcile intuition with formalism. Thea, however, methodically applied her framework, testing each step against defined constraints, ensuring that every conclusion was defensible. She paused at key points to verify calculations, cross-referencing her notebook and digital notes. The classroom was silent except for the scratch of pencils and the occasional soft adjustment of seating. Hayes observed quietly from the back, his face a mask of neutrality, but his internal evaluation was active, cataloging patterns, consistency, and independent reasoning. 45 minutes passed. Hayes collected the papers in silence, stacking them neatly, his expression unreadable. Students filed out cautiously, some whispering, some exhaling in relief, others glancing nervously at the papers in their hands. Thea remained seated briefly, reviewing her work one last time, ensuring that each step was defensible and each assumption explicit. She understood that performance, rigor, and independence had been tested repeatedly. Now the culmination rested in clear documentation and logical consistency. Later, the results were posted. Grades were distributed quietly, without fanfare. Thea retrieved her paper and examined it carefully. Every derivation was acknowledged, every conditional argument validated. The comments noted precision, clarity, and consistency. A single word in the margin summarized her performance: exemplary. Unlike previous evaluations, there was no hidden message, no reframing, no C-. Recognition, finally, was clear. Hayes, reviewing her paper privately, allowed himself a moment of reflection. For decades, he had maintained control through authority and expectation. Yet Thea Gibson had demonstrated that consistent, independent reasoning, grounded in disciplined analysis, could challenge hierarchy without chaos. The recognition was not public celebration, but internal acknowledgement of merit. Faculty colleagues noted the shift in performance, the demonstration of consistent depth, and quietly remarked on her potential. Hayes realized that influence in the seminar could not merely be enforced. It could be demonstrated, respected, and recalibrated. For Thea, the journey had not been about a single proof, a single grade, or even recognition. It had been about sustaining intellectual independence, demonstrating disciplined reasoning, and navigating the pressures of expectation with composure. She understood that the Academy valued consistency and clarity, but that true competence was also measured by the ability to maintain methodical, defensible reasoning under scrutiny. She had learned to balance creativity with rigor, independence with accountability, and insight with precision. As the semester closed, the relationship between Hayes and Thea settled into a new equilibrium. Authority remained, but mutual respect emerged, grounded in evidence, performance, and consistent intellectual rigor. Thea's scholarship was secure, her reputation within the seminar established, and her understanding of academic structures deepened. Hayes, too, recalibrated his expectations, recognizing that brilliance, when disciplined and consistent, demanded acknowledgement, even within traditional hierarchies. And so, the final lesson was clear. In the intersection of intellect, authority, and independence, respect and recognition are earned not through spectacle, but through sustained performance, disciplined reasoning, and unwavering clarity. Thea Gibson had learned this, Whitmore University had learned this, and Professor Edmund Hayes, for the first time in decades, had quietly, privately, recognized a student whose presence could no longer be contained by hierarchy alone. The semester ended. Thea closed her notebook one final time, ready for what came next. Not because she had proved herself once, but because she had demonstrated that excellence, rigor, and independence could persist, even under scrutiny. And that understanding, in the end, was its own reward.